Welcome to Bedtime Boss, where every night begins with a story, and every story leads you to rest. Here, the noise of the world fades into silence, and shadows turn into whispers that guide you gently into dreams. Tonight, let the weight of the day slip away, breathe a little slower, and allow this tale to carry you safely, softly into the calm you deserve. September 16, 1931. 3 members of Detroit's Purple Gang walked into what they believed was a peace meeting at the Collingwood Manor apartment. They never walked out. The Purple Gang, led by the Bernstein brothers, had grown into Detroit's dominant criminal force, and the Collingwood Manor Massacre is commonly named the turning point. This wasn't just another gangland killing, it was the moment that destroyed one of America's most feared criminal organizations from within. The Purple Gang had built their empire on violence and intimidation, controlling Detroit's bootlegging trade and earning respect from crime bosses across the country. But internal conflicts had been brewing, and this single act of betrayal would bring down an empire that had taken a decade to build. To understand how it all unraveled, we need to go back to where it began. In the crowded immigrant neighborhoods, where desperate children learned that survival meant everything. Detroit's Jewish East Side, often called Little Jerusalem, became the breeding ground for what would become one of America's most notorious criminal organizations. In these crowded immigrant neighborhoods, where families from Poland, Russia, and Lithuania struggled to establish themselves, young men quickly learned that legitimate opportunities were scarce and respect came through different channels. The Bernstein brothers Raymond, Joseph and Abraham grew up watching their parents work, exhausting hours for minimal pay, while other families seemed to prosper through less conventional means. The neighborhood's hierarchy was clear to anyone who paid attention. While immigrant parents labored in factories and sweatshops, older teenagers walked the streets with confidence, wearing clean clothes and carrying thick rolls of cash. These young men didn't punch time clocks or bow to factory supervisors. School offered little hope for advancement. Teachers viewed the immigrant children as future factory workers, focusing on basic skills and obedience rather than ambition. The real education happened in the streets, where older boys shared lessons about survival and opportunity. They explained which merchants could be intimidated, which dock workers would look away from suspicious cargo, and which police officers could be bought with weekly payments. The Bernstein brothers started with simple ventures. They demanded nickels from younger children, stole fruit from street vendors, and learned to work in pairs so one could distract while the other grabbed merchandise. When shopkeepers complained about theft, the brothers offered protection services in exchange for weekly payments. The irony was lost on merchants who paid the same boys who had been robbing them. Weeks earlier, their operation initially formed around the Oakland Sugar House, where young criminals from the East Side would gather and plan their activities. This location gave birth to their first identity, the Sugar House Boys, also known as the Oakland Sugar House Gang. Other neighborhood children gravitated toward the Bernstein brothers, drawn by their growing reputation and the promise of steady income. Sammy Cohen and Irving Milberg joined their expanding network, each bringing their own skills and connections that broadened the group's reach throughout the neighborhood. The transformation from petty criminals to serious threats happened gradually. A shopkeeper who refused protection money might find his windows broken overnight. Rival groups that challenged their territory faced coordinated attacks that left members hospitalized. The brothers discovered that their reputation for violence could be more valuable than violence itself. Merchants began paying simply to avoid finding out what would happen if they refused. Violence became both their business, tool, and source of entertainment. They didn't just beat rivals, they made sure the beatings were public and memorable. They didn't simply steal money, they humiliated victims in ways that would discourage others from resisting future demands. Each act of brutality served multiple purposes: immediate profit, long-term intimidation, and the psychological satisfaction of wielding power over others. By the time Raymond turned 18, he commanded loyalty from more than 20 young men willing to risk arrest or injury for easy money and brotherhood. Joseph had developed connections with dock workers, who provided information about valuable cargo shipments. Isidore had earned a reputation for handling problems that required immediate and decisive violence. Abraham showed talent for managing money and keeping track of debts and payments. The loose confederation they assembled operated without formal structure or written rules. Held together by shared profits and mutual fear of betrayal, they controlled protection rackets in dozens of neighborhood businesses, ran gambling operations in basement rooms, and had begun exploring opportunities in the growing market for illegal alcohol. Their success attracted attention from older, more established criminals who recognized their potential for larger operations. The neighborhood that had failed to provide legitimate opportunities had created something far more dangerous, a group of intelligent, ambitious young men who had learned that society's rules didn't apply to those willing to ignore them. These weren't desperate criminals acting out of hunger. They were calculating entrepreneurs who had identified violence as their most profitable skill. As their influence expanded beyond the East Side, the Sugar House Boys found themselves competing with dozens of other street gangs for territory and respect. Each group needed something that would set them apart, something that would announce their presence and intentions to Detroit's criminal underworld. What they needed was a name that would become synonymous with fear itself. Asterisk. Detroit's underworld in the early 1920s was crowded with ambitious criminals, each group trying to establish dominance over profitable territories and illegal businesses. The East Side had the River Gang, who controlled dock activities along the Detroit River. The West Side claimed the West Side Mob, specialists in armed robbery and extortion. Downtown belonged to various Italian families who had imported their organizational methods from Sicily and southern Italy. Each gang operated within clearly defined boundaries, and crossing into another group's territory meant risking violent retaliation. The Bernstein brothers understood that their loose collection of neighborhood criminals needed something more than just reputation to compete with these established organizations. They needed an identity that would immediately communicate their willingness to use extreme violence, their unity as a group, and their complete rejection of society's rules. A proper name would serve as psychological warfare, striking fear into rivals before the first punch was thrown or the first shot was fired. Historians offer several competing explanations for how they acquired their infamous name. Some accounts connect the name to their early association with members of the Oakland Sugar House Gang, suggesting the Bernstein brothers adopted certain identifying markers as a tribute to their criminal mentors. Another version links the name to Detroit's streetcar system, claiming the gang conducted so many operations along specific routes that locals began using the transit line's color coding to identify which criminal group was responsible for crimes in particular areas. The most widely cited explanation was also the most direct. According to this version, other criminals began calling them the Purple Gang because they were rotten to the core, like fruit that had spoiled and turned purple with decay. This comparison wasn't meant as a compliment, it was recognition that the Bernstein brothers and their followers had crossed lines that even experienced criminals respected. They showed no mercy to victims, no loyalty to criminal traditions, and no restraint when violence could serve their purposes. The fruit comparison captured something essential about their approach to criminal activities. Most gangs used violence strategically, applying just enough force to achieve their immediate goals while avoiding unnecessary attention from law enforcement. The Bernstein brothers seemed to enjoy violence for its own sake, inflicting far more damage than necessary, and leaving victims who would serve as permanent warnings to others. They were criminals who had gone bad in a way that made other criminals uncomfortable. Whatever its origins, The name Purple Gang quickly functioned as a brand of shorthand for brutality and control that made negotiations and threats simpler in Detroit's underworld. The name spread through criminal circles with remarkable speed, passed along in whispered conversations between criminals, corrupt police officers, and nervous business owners. Pool hall operators mentioned the Purple Gang when explaining why certain tables were suddenly off limits to regular customers. Dock workers used the name when discussing which shipments had mysteriously disappeared during overnight shifts. Neighborhood merchants spoke of the Purple Gang when other business owners asked about their new security arrangements and weekly protection payments. Criminal organizations that had operated independently for years began altering their plans when they learned the Purple Gang was involved in similar activities. Bank robbers postponed jobs after hearing that the Bernstein brothers were planning to hit the same targets. Bootleggers changed their smuggling routes to avoid conflicts with Purple Gang operations. Even established crime families began showing respect for the new organization. Recognizing that cooperation might be preferable to conflict, the psychological power of the name became apparent. During criminal negotiations and territorial disputes, simply mentioning Purple Gang involvement could end arguments that might otherwise escalate into violent confrontations. Business owners who might resist other criminal groups immediately agreed to pay protection money when they learned the Purple Gang was making the demands. The name carried implications of consequences that were worse than simple robbery or assault. Police officers began using the Purple Gang name as shorthand for a particular type of criminal activity: violent, well-organized, and completely ruthless. Newspaper reporters adopted the name when covering crimes that showed signs of excessive violence or professional planning. The name became a brand that communicated specific expectations about the methods and motivations of the criminals involved. By 1925, the Purple Gang name had become more valuable than money or weapons in Detroit's criminal hierarchy. It opened doors that had been closed to smaller gangs, ended disputes before they could escalate into costly wars, and provided instant credibility in criminal negotiations. The name alone could accomplish what other gangs needed: violence and intimidation to achieve. But psychological warfare and fearsome reputations meant nothing without the physical territory and steady profits needed to sustain a criminal empire. The Bernstein brothers now faced the challenge of transforming their hard-earned reputation into lasting criminal success. They needed something bigger than neighborhood protection rackets and petty theft. They needed an opportunity that would match their ambitions and provide the kind of wealth that could fund a real criminal organization. That opportunity was about to present itself in the form of a new federal law that would transform Detroit into one of America's most profitable criminal markets. January 16, 1920 brought the 18th Amendment into effect, making the production, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages illegal across the United States. Politicians celebrated the dawn of a new moral era, while temperance advocates predicted the end of society's drinking problems. What they had actually created was the largest criminal opportunity in American history, and geography would determine which criminals could seize it most effectively. Detroit occupied a unique position that would prove more valuable than gold mines or oil fields. The city sat directly across the Detroit River from Windsor, Ontario, where Canadian laws still permitted the legal manufacture and sale of alcohol. The narrow waterway that separated the two cities measured less than a mile at its widest point, and in winter, when the river froze solid, smugglers could simply walk contraband across the ice. This proximity to legal alcohol created an enormous business advantage that criminals in other cities could only dream about. Canadian warehouses in Windsor filled with cases of whiskey, gin, and rum that had been legal to produce, but were now worth their weight in gold. Just a few hundred yards away, in Michigan, the only challenge was moving the merchandise across the water without attracting attention from federal agents. The Detroit River quickly transformed into the busiest smuggling route in North America. Small boats crossed under cover of darkness, their hulls loaded with cases of Canadian liquor, destined for Detroit speakeasies and private customers. Larger vessels used fog as cover, making multiple trips per night when weather conditions provided adequate concealment. Dock workers along both sides of the river found themselves in positions of enormous power and profit, as American customs officials could be persuaded to focus their attention elsewhere for the right price. The Purple Gang watched this lucrative traffic with growing interest and ambition. Raymond Bernstein understood that their neighborhood protection rackets and small-time theft operations were generating pennies compared to the fortunes being made on the water. The same criminal skills they had developed through years of street crime planning organization and the willingness to use violence could be applied to much larger and more profitable enterprises. Their entry into bootlegging began with simple hijacking operations. Purple Gang members would wait at strategic points along the Detroit shoreline where smuggling boats typically landed their cargo. Using superior numbers and firepower, they would overwhelm smuggling crews and steal entire shipments that represented weeks of planning and substantial financial investment. These hijackings served multiple purposes: immediate profit from stolen liquor, elimination of competition, and demonstration of their power to other criminals operating on the river. The stolen Canadian whiskey found eager buyers throughout Detroit's rapidly expanding network of illegal drinking establishments. Speakeasy operators cared little about the source of their liquor, as long as it was genuine and reasonably priced. The Purple Gang's reputation for violence actually helped in these negotiations, as buyers knew that purchasing from them meant protection from other criminals who might attempt to rob the establishments or steal their inventory. Within months of their first successful hijacking, the Purple Gang had established working relationships with corrupt dock workers who provided advance information about valuable shipments. These inside sources would identify boats carrying the highest quality liquor, specify landing times and locations, and warn about increased federal surveillance. The intelligence network allowed the gang to target the most profitable operations, while avoiding unnecessary risks. The success of their hijacking operations provided capital for more ambitious ventures. The Purple Gang began purchasing their own boats and establishing direct relationships with Canadian suppliers. Instead of stealing from other smugglers, they could now import liquor directly, controlling every aspect of the operation, from purchase to street sale. This vertical integration eliminated middlemen and maximized profits, while reducing dependence on opportunities for theft. They supplied premium Canadian brands, such as Old Log Cabin, to partners in Chicago, building relationships that would prove crucial to their expanding influence. Corrupt police officers and federal agents became essential partners in these expanded operations. Weekly payments ensured that law enforcement would focus their attention on independent smugglers rather than Purple Gang activities. Tip-offs about planned raids allowed the gang to move their operations to safer locations. Some corrupt officials even provided protection during river crossings, ensuring that Purple Gang boats could operate without fear of arrest or seizure. The transformation was remarkable in both speed and scale. Within 2 years of Prohibition's start, the Purple Gang was moving thousands of gallons of Canadian liquor across the Detroit River each month. Their monthly profits exceeded what most legitimate businesses earned in entire years. The river, that had once been simply a boundary between two countries, had become their personal highway to wealth and power. The success of their bootlegging operations proved that the Purple Gang possessed more than just street fighting skills and neighborhood intimidation tactics. They had demonstrated the organizational ability and strategic thinking necessary to manage complex criminal enterprises involving multiple participants. Substantial financial investments and constant law enforcement pressure. The Detroit River had provided the foundation for their criminal empire, but their growing wealth and reputation created new challenges that would require different solutions. Managing vast profits and coordinating multiple criminal operations demanded more than the loose collection of street criminals they had started with. ***. The Bernstein brothers understood that raw talent and street reputation could only take them so far. Contemporary accounts credit the Bernstein family with central leadership, and historians note that responsibilities were divided across leadership and operations. Different brothers took leading roles. Raymond emerged as the strategic planner, calculating moves like a chess player and anticipating problems before they developed into serious threats. Joseph coordinated street-level operations, maintaining relationships with dock workers, corrupt police officers, and neighborhood criminals who provided essential information and services. Isidore became known for enforcement, while Abraham handled financial matters, keeping track of income from various sources and the complex network of payments that kept their operations running smoothly. This informal but effective division of labor allowed the gang to scale up quickly, creating redundancy that protected the Purple Gang from the arrests or deaths that had destroyed many smaller criminal groups. If one brother was temporarily unavailable, the others could continue operating without significant disruption to their business activities. The brothers began actively recruiting smaller gangs and independent criminals who had been operating without organizational support or steady income. These recruitment efforts weren't based on friendship or ethnic loyalty. They were business decisions designed to acquire useful skills and eliminate potential competition. Independent criminals who joined the Purple Gang received regular pay, protection from rivals, and access to more profitable criminal opportunities than they could obtain on their own. The Oakland Sugar House Gang represented their first major acquisition, bringing 20 experienced bootleggers who already understood the technical aspects of liquor smuggling and distribution. The Purples operated as a flexible network rather than a rigid, old-world crime family, which helped explain how they scaled so quickly. These new members possessed boats, established relationships with Canadian suppliers, and detailed knowledge of federal law enforcement patterns along the Detroit River. Rather than fighting a costly war to eliminate the Sugar House Gang, the Bernstein brothers offered partnership that benefited everyone involved while expanding Purple Gang capabilities. Sammy Cohen accepted a position as key lieutenant, coordinating operations across Detroit's sprawling criminal landscape. His recruitment demonstrated the Purple Gang's growing reputation and their ability to attract talented criminals who had other options for employment. Cohen brought his own network of contacts and his experience with large-scale criminal operations, adding another layer of professional expertise to the organization. The flexible network structure provided significant advantages in adapting quickly to new opportunities or unexpected threats. When federal agents increased surveillance of river smuggling operations, Purple Gang crews could shift to land-based activities without requiring lengthy reorganization. When rival gangs attempted to move into Purple Gang territory, multiple crews could coordinate responses that overwhelmed the intruders. The organizational flexibility also helped maintain loyalty among members who might otherwise have become frustrated with rigid command structures. Experienced criminals appreciated the ability to suggest new ideas and influence operational decisions rather than simply following orders without explanation. This participatory approach created stronger commitment to the organization's success, while encouraging innovation and creative problem-solving. Shared profits provided the most effective method of maintaining loyalty and discipline within the separate expanding organization, rather than keeping all earnings for themselves. The Bernstein brothers established payment systems that rewarded successful operations and provided steady income even during slower periods. Members understood that their personal financial success depended directly on the Purple Gang's continued prosperity, creating powerful incentives for cooperation and mutual support. The recruitment strategy focused on criminals who possessed specific skills or controlled access to valuable resources. Dock workers who could provide advance information about cargo shipments received regular payments and protection from rival gangs. Police officers who agreed to warn about planned raids or ignore certain criminal activities became permanent assets rather than one-time purchases. Corrupt federal agents who could influence investigations or delay prosecutions received long-term financial arrangements that ensured their continued cooperation. By 1926, the Purple Gang had successfully united dozens of independent criminals under one organizational umbrella, creating a criminal army capable of overwhelming any rival through superior numbers, coordination, and firepower. The transformation from neighborhood thugs to organized criminal enterprise had taken less than 6 years, demonstrating both the brothers' leadership abilities and the opportunities available in Detroit's wide-open criminal environment. Their reputation for organizational sophistication had spread beyond Detroit, attracting attention from established crime families in other cities who recognized the Purple Gang as serious competitors rather than local troublemakers. The Bernstein brothers had proven they possessed the strategic vision and management skills necessary to build lasting criminal enterprises. But organizational structure and loyal membership meant nothing without the steady flow of profits needed to fund their expanding operations. The Purple Gang had built an impressive criminal machine, but that machine required constant feeding. They needed operations that could generate the kind of money that would keep their growing army of criminals satisfied and their network of corrupt officials properly motivated. The solution would come from recognizing a fundamental truth about the bootlegging business that most criminals had overlooked. Hijacking offered outsized returns because it avoided the upfront production costs and dangerous river crossings that independent bootleggers had to manage themselves. Independent smugglers invested their own money in Canadian liquor, risked arrest during border crossings, and spent weeks establishing distribution networks throughout Detroit. The Purple Gang recognized that stealing these finished operations provided all the benefits without the initial investments or most dangerous activities. Their transformation of hijacking, from opportunistic theft into systematic business operations, began with intelligence gathering that rivals couldn't match. Dock workers along the Detroit River provided detailed information about incoming shipments, including the exact types of liquor being smuggled, the number of men protecting each boat, and the specific landing times and locations. This advance knowledge allowed the Purple Gang to select targets based on profit potential rather than random opportunity, ensuring that their efforts focused on the most valuable operations. The planning for each hijacking operation demonstrated careful attention to detail. Gang members would study landing sites days in advance, identifying escape routes and potential hiding places where stolen merchandise could be temporarily stored. They calculated the number of men needed to overwhelm specific smuggling crews, ensuring that their forces would achieve decisive numerical superiority. Weapons were distributed based on the expected resistance, with experienced gunmen assigned to operations involving well-armed smuggling crews. They worked with affiliated crews, sometimes called the Little Jewish Navy, a loose network of boat operators who helped move stolen liquor across the Detroit River and coordinate water-based operations. This affiliated group provided additional boats and experienced river pilots who understood the complex currents and seasonal changes that affected smuggling activities. When the Purple Gang struck, their attacks combined overwhelming force with carefully orchestrated timing that left victims no opportunity to mount effective resistance. Multiple gang members would emerge from concealed positions simultaneously, surrounding smuggling crews before they could organize defensive responses. The initial assault would be swift and decisive, with Purple Gang members using superior numbers to isolate individual smugglers and prevent coordinated resistance. Their violence was notorious and often extreme, extending far beyond what was necessary to secure stolen merchandise. While other criminal organizations might negotiate with smuggling crews or offer them opportunities to walk away unharmed. Purple Gang operations frequently left victims requiring medical attention even when they offered no resistance. This excessive brutality served multiple strategic purposes beyond simple intimidation. Each violent hijacking created dozens of witnesses, who would spread stories throughout Detroit's criminal underworld about the consequences of opposing the Purple Gang. Smuggling crews who survived these encounters would warn other bootleggers about the risks of operating in areas controlled by the Bernstein brothers, effectively expanding Purple Gang territory without requiring additional violence. The psychological impact of their reputation began generating profits that exceeded the value of stolen merchandise. Independent bootleggers who had never been attacked by the Purple Gang started paying weekly protection money simply to avoid becoming targets. These payments created steady income streams that continued even when hijacking operations were temporarily suspended due to increased law enforcement activity or seasonal changes in smuggling patterns. The profits from their hijacking operations funded continuous improvements in equipment and operational capabilities that made future operations even more effective. Better weapons allowed smaller Purple Gang crews to overwhelm larger smuggling operations. Faster boats enabled them to pursue victims who attempted to escape across the Detroit River. Radio equipment provided communication between gang members. During complex operations involving multiple locations, corrupt officials became increasingly valuable assets as hijacking operations expanded in scale and frequency. Police officers who could delay responses to hijacking reports gave Purple Gang members additional time to complete their operations and escape with stolen merchandise. Federal agents who provided advance warning about planned enforcement activities allowed the gang to avoid operations during periods of heightened surveillance. Dock workers who could identify the most valuable shipments ensured that hijacking efforts focused on targets that justified the risks involved. The reinvestment of hijacking profits into bribes and corruption created a protective network that made Purple Gang operations increasingly difficult for law enforcement to disrupt. Each successful hijacking generated funds for additional bribes, which reduced the risks associated with future operations, which enabled more ambitious hijacking plans that generated even larger profits. This cycle of success and reinvestment transformed the Purple Gang from opportunistic criminals into a sophisticated criminal organization. The reputation for extreme violence that emerged from their hijacking operations began affecting legitimate businesses throughout Detroit's waterfront district. Shipping companies started hiring additional security guards for valuable cargo, increasing their operational costs and reducing profit margins. Insurance companies raised premiums for businesses operating near the Detroit River, reflecting the increased risks associated with Purple Gang activity. By 1927, the Purple Gang's hijacking operations had generated millions in profits, while simultaneously eliminating most independent competition along the Detroit River. Bootleggers from other cities began avoiding Detroit entirely, preferring to operate in areas controlled by less violent criminal organizations. The few smuggling operations that continued working in Detroit waters did so only after reaching accommodation with the Purple Gang, usually involving substantial tribute payments. The success of their systematic approach to hijacking had established the Purple Gang as the dominant criminal force on the Great Lakes, controlling smuggling routes that supplied illegal alcohol to cities throughout the Midwest. Their reputation for violence and organizational sophistication had spread far beyond Detroit, reaching the attention of criminal organizations that operated on a national scale. That attention would soon come from the most powerful criminal organization in America. Al Capone's empire had expanded across the Midwest through a proven strategy: identify local criminal leaders, make partnership offers, and either absorb willing allies or eliminate stubborn competitors. This approach had succeeded in Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Kansas City, Where local gangs lacked the organization to resist Chicago's advances, Detroit represented the ultimate prize in Capone's expansion plans. The city's location across from Canada made it the most valuable smuggling hub in North America. With access to unlimited supplies of legal alcohol that could cross the narrow Detroit River with minimal risk. Controlling Detroit would give Capone's organization control over liquor distribution throughout the Great Lakes region. Capone's initial intelligence reports suggested Detroit would follow familiar patterns. Local gangs appeared small and disorganized, focused on neighborhood territories rather than large-scale operations. They seemed to lack sophisticated leadership and operated independently rather than under unified command, making them vulnerable to tactics that had proven successful elsewhere. The advance team Capone sent to Detroit expected to find criminal leaders impressed by the opportunity to join a nationwide organization with unlimited resources and political connections. They carried substantial cash to fund immediate operations and buy cooperation from local officials. They also brought experienced gunmen to handle any violent resistance. Instead, Capone's representatives discovered that the Purple Gang had already accomplished what Capone's organization was attempting to do. The Bernstein brothers had united dozens of independent criminals under centralized leadership, controlled the most profitable smuggling routes along the Detroit River, and established a fear-based reputation that took most criminal organizations years to develop, rather than finding disorganized local gangs ripe for absorption. They encountered a sophisticated criminal enterprise that showed no interest in subordinating itself to outside authority. The Purple Gang's control over Detroit's criminal landscape was far more complete than Capone's intelligence had suggested. They didn't simply operate protection rackets or run gambling operations. They had created a criminal monopoly that extended into every illegal activity in the city. Independent bootleggers paid tribute to avoid being hijacked. Gambling operations required Purple Gang approval to operate safely. Even prostitution and drug dealing happened with their permission and protection. More concerning to Capone's representatives was the Purple Gang's reputation for violence that exceeded even Chicago standards. Capone's organization used violence strategically, applying just enough force to achieve specific objectives while avoiding unnecessary federal attention. The Purple Gang seemed to embrace brutality as an end in itself, leaving trails of beaten victims that served no practical purpose beyond intimidation. Reports from Capone's advance team described Purple Gang operations that demonstrated both tactical sophistication and complete disregard for human life. Their hijacking operations involve careful planning and coordination that impressed even experienced Chicago gunmen. Their enforcement activities included methods that hardened criminals found disturbing. Their willingness to kill over minor disputes suggested either complete confidence in their ability to avoid prosecution or genuine indifference to consequences. Capone faced a strategic decision that would influence his organization's future expansion throughout the Midwest. He could commit substantial resources to a war against the Purple Gang, risking heavy casualties and attracting federal attention that might compromise operations in other cities. Or he could explore partnership arrangements that would give his organization access to Detroit's smuggling routes while allowing the Purple Gang to maintain operational control over their territory. The decision became easier when Capone's representatives reported that the Purple Gang possessed both the firepower and tactical knowledge necessary to make any war extremely costly. Their network of corrupt police officers and federal agents would provide advance warning about any Chicago-based assault on Detroit. Their established relationships with Canadian suppliers would allow them to continue importing weapons and ammunition even during extended conflict. Most importantly, their reputation for extreme violence would likely attract support from other criminal organizations who feared that successful Capone expansion into Detroit would threaten their own territories. Negotiations began through intermediaries, who could explore partnership possibilities without either side appearing to make concessions or show weakness. The discussions focused on practical arrangements that would benefit both organizations while avoiding direct competition in overlapping territories. Capone needed reliable supplies of high-quality Canadian whiskey for distribution throughout his Midwest network. The Purple Gang needed protection from federal authorities, who might otherwise focus enforcement efforts on their Detroit operations. The partnership agreement that emerged gave Capone exclusive access to Old Log Cabin whiskey, a premium Canadian brand that commanded top prices in Chicago speakeasies and private clubs. The Purple Gang would handle all smuggling operations and transportation to Chicago, while Capone's organization would manage distribution throughout Illinois and surrounding states. Both sides would maintain their existing territories and operations without interference from their new partners. This business relationship represented a major strategic triumph for the Purple Gang. Rather than being absorbed or eliminated by a larger organization, they had negotiated as equals with America's most powerful crime boss. Some contemporaries suspected Purple Gang members of assisting in Chicago operations, including roles alleged in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. But these claims remain unproven. The alliance provided legitimacy for the Purple Gang that extended far beyond simple business arrangements. Association with Capone's organization gave them recognition as major players in America's criminal hierarchy rather than regional troublemakers. Federal authorities who might otherwise have targeted the Purple Gang now hesitated to interfere with operations that could provoke retaliation from Capone's much larger organization. The success of their bootlegging partnership encouraged the Purple Gang to explore criminal enterprises that promised steady profits even after Prohibition eventually ended. The Bernstein brothers understood that diversification would be essential for long-term survival. Their next target would prove that criminal opportunity existed far beyond the waterfront. Detroit's cleaning and dyeing industry presented the perfect combination of vulnerability and profitability that the Purple Gang had learned to recognize and exploit. The industry's structure created ideal conditions for criminal intervention. Dozens of small family-owned cleaning establishments competed fiercely for the same customers throughout Detroit's neighborhoods, operating on thin profit margins while owners worked long hours to match competitors' low prices. The constant price cutting had created a destructive cycle where no business could earn enough profit to invest in better equipment or expand operations. Business owners complained constantly about unfair competition from establishments that cut corners on quality or employed workers at below-market wages. Some cleaning shops stayed open 7 days a week to attract customers who needed weekend service. Others offered pickup and delivery services that increased costs but helped differentiate them from competitors. The competitive pressure was destroying profits throughout the industry, while making life difficult for owners who struggled to support their families. The Purple Gang recognized that these frustrated business owners would welcome any solution that promised stable prices and predictable profits. Criminal organizations had successfully imposed order on chaotic industries in other cities, creating trade associations that eliminated destructive competition while generating steady income for the gangs that controlled them. Raymond Bernstein developed a plan that combined legitimate business organization with criminal enforcement methods. The Purple Gang would establish the Wholesale Cleaners and Dyers Association, presenting it as a trade organization designed to help small businesses compete more effectively against larger operations. Members would agree to standardized pricing that eliminated destructive price wars while ensuring reasonable profits for all participants. The association would also provide collective bargaining power with suppliers and coordinate marketing efforts that benefited the entire industry. The proposal sounded reasonable to business owners who had been struggling with competitive pressures for years. Association membership would guarantee minimum prices for standard services, preventing competitors from undercutting established businesses through predatory pricing. Members would also receive protection from labor disputes and assistance with equipment purchases that individual businesses couldn't afford independently. Business owners who joined the association initially experienced the promised benefits. Price stability allowed them to plan operations more effectively and invest in equipment improvements that had been impossible during earlier price wars. Protection from labor disputes meant they could focus on serving customers rather than negotiating with workers who demanded higher wages or better working conditions. However, businesses that refused to join the association quickly discovered the consequences of remaining independent. Their delivery trucks would suffer mysterious mechanical failures that required expensive repairs. Windows would be broken during overnight hours when no witnesses were present. Customers would receive anonymous warnings about the quality of services provided by non-association businesses when subtle pressure failed to achieve compliance. The Purple Gang demonstrated their willingness to use more direct methods. Property sabotage and bombings were used as pressure tactics against cleaning establishments that continued operating outside the association. Equipment was sabotaged in ways that would be discovered only when customers complained about ruined clothing or poor service quality. The violence served multiple purposes beyond simple intimidation. Each attack generated publicity that reminded other businesses about the benefits of association membership while eliminating sources of price competition that threatened association members. Most importantly, the escalating violence demonstrated that the Purple Gang possessed both the determination and capability to destroy any business that challenged their authority. Business owners who attempted organized resistance discovered that the Purple Gang had prepared for collective opposition. When several cleaning shop owners met to discuss hiring private security or appealing to law enforcement for protection, they found their meeting locations had been infiltrated by Purple Gang informants. Plans for coordinated resistance were known to gang leadership before they could be implemented, allowing preventive action that discouraged future organizing efforts. The campaign continued until most of Detroit's cleaning industry was paying regular tribute to the association. The few businesses that maintained independence operated in constant fear of retaliation and faced competitive disadvantages that made their survival increasingly difficult. The Purple Gang had successfully transformed a legitimate industry into a criminal enterprise that generated steady profits through systematic extortion. The Cleaners and Dyers War dominated the laundry unions and demonstrated the Purple Gang's mastery of labor racketeering. Their success attracted national attention from criminal organizations seeking to replicate their methods in other cities. In 1928, 13 Purple Gang members were tried for extortion in connection with the Cleaners and Dyers War, but all were acquitted. The trial's outcome showed that even public prosecution could not immediately end their influence or disrupt their operations. The acquittals sent a clear message throughout Detroit's business community that the Purple Gang operated with virtual immunity from legal consequences. Their reputation for controlling both criminal enterprises and legitimate industries had been enhanced rather than damaged by their courtroom victory. Other trade associations and labor unions began approaching Purple Gang leadership for protection and organizational assistance, recognizing that cooperation offered better prospects than resistance. But the methods that had made the Purple Gang successful in labor racketeering were the same brutal tactics that had earned them a reputation that extended far beyond Detroit's borders. Their willingness to use extreme violence had become their signature, distinguishing them from other criminal organizations that operated with more restraint. That reputation for brutality set them apart from every other criminal organization in America. Some historians and contemporaries argued the Purple's reputation for cold brutality exceeded even that of major Chicago mobs. The criminal underworld of the 1920s operated according to unwritten rules that most gangsters understood and respected. Violence served specific purposes, eliminating rivals who threatened business operations. disciplining subordinates who violated organizational loyalty, or sending clear messages to law enforcement and competitors about the consequences of interference. Even Al Capone's Chicago organization, notorious for its brutality and body count, applied violence with calculated precision designed to achieve maximum impact while minimizing unnecessary attention from federal authorities. The Purple Gang operated by entirely different principles that disturbed even experienced criminals who had witnessed decades of gangland warfare, where other organizations used violence as a tool for achieving business objectives. The Bernstein brothers and their associates seemed to view brutality as both business necessity and personal satisfaction. Their killings were unusually brutal and intended to terrorize witnesses and rivals. Their methods went far beyond what was necessary to accomplish practical goals, incorporating elements of psychological warfare that served no purpose except to ensure complete submission from anyone who might consider resistance. The gang's approach to witness elimination revealed their complete disregard for conventional criminal wisdom about avoiding unnecessary attention. Most criminal organizations understood that killing witnesses generated intense law enforcement pressure and media coverage that threatened their other operations. When witnesses had to be eliminated, experienced criminals made sure the deaths appeared accidental or were carried out in ways that couldn't be traced back to the organization responsible. Purple Gang members made no effort to disguise their involvement in witness killings, often making sure that potential witnesses understood exactly what fate awaited anyone who considered cooperating with law enforcement. Witnesses didn't simply disappear quietly. They vanished in ways that generated maximum fear among anyone who might have information about Purple Gang activities. The message was always clear. Cooperation with authorities meant death, and that death would serve as a warning to others. Criminal organizations throughout the Midwest began altering their operational plans, specifically to avoid conflicts with the Purple Gang. Bootleggers from Chicago who had operated successfully against other violent gangs would change their smuggling routes rather than risk encounters with Purple Gang hijacking crews. Bank robbers who feared no other criminals would postpone jobs when they learned that Purple Gang members were planning similar operations in the same areas. Professional killers from New York and Chicago, men who had built reputations for efficiency in their home cities, spoke of the Purple Gang with obvious uneasiness that revealed genuine fear beneath their tough exterior presentations. These experienced gunmen had killed dozens of people during their criminal careers, but they recognized something different and disturbing about the Purple Gang's approach to violence that went beyond simple professional brutality. The gang's willingness to escalate minor disputes into deadly confrontations convinced most of Detroit's criminal underworld that any conflict with the Purple Gang would inevitably result in death. Other criminal organizations might negotiate territorial boundaries, agree to percentage splits of profitable operations, or find mutually beneficial solutions to business conflicts. The Purple Gang's response to any challenge was immediate, an overwhelming violence that ended disputes through elimination of everyone involved. Contemporary press and later historians estimated the gang's homicide toll at a very high number. Estimates vary and remain contested, but most accounts suggest the Purple Gang was linked to hundreds of killings during their peak years. Many of these deaths were never officially classified as homicides due to the gang's success in making bodies disappear completely. Missing persons reports involving known criminals or potential witnesses often represented additional Purple Gang killings that couldn't be proven without physical evidence. The gang's reputation for extreme violence became more valuable than weapons, money, or political connections in Detroit's criminal hierarchy. Other criminal organizations would abandon profitable operations rather than compete directly with Purple Gang interests. Business owners would immediately agree to pay protection money when they learned the Purple Gang was involved, without attempting negotiation or seeking alternative solutions. Law enforcement officers found themselves reluctant to investigate Purple Gang activities too aggressively, understanding that their own families might become targets if their investigations threatened the organization's operations. Federal agents who had successfully infiltrated other criminal organizations made no serious attempts to place undercover operatives within Purple Gang operations, recognizing that discovery would result in deaths that would serve as warnings. Two other potential infiltrators. The psychological impact of their reputation allowed the Purple Gang to control vast criminal territories and enterprises with relatively few actual violent confrontations. Most potential rivals and business partners understood the consequences of resistance so clearly that they cooperated voluntarily rather than risk experiencing Purple Gang brutality firsthand. The mere mention of possible Purple Gang involvement could end criminal negotiations immediately, with all parties agreeing to whatever terms the gang proposed. However, the same extreme brutality that had built their criminal empire was creating dangerous tensions within their own organization. The success that had made them wealthy and feared was also generating problems that the Bernstein brothers had never anticipated. Their loose organizational structure, which had allowed rapid expansion during the bootlegging boom, was beginning to strain under the weight of their own prosperity. Money was flowing in faster than the Bernstein brothers had ever imagined possible. By 1930, their criminal empire generated more in a single month than most legitimate businesses earned in entire years. Bootlegging operations moved thousands of gallons of Canadian liquor across the Detroit River weekly, while protection rackets extracted tribute from hundreds of businesses throughout the city. The Cleaners and Dyers Association alone provided steady income that exceeded the profits from many of their earlier criminal ventures. Success had transformed the Bernstein brothers from neighborhood thugs into wealthy criminal executives who commanded respect from organized crime figures across the country. But rapid expansion had produced overlapping territories where different crews suddenly competed for the same customers, protection targets, and smuggling routes. Younger members who had joined during the prosperous bootlegging years chafed at leadership decisions and began cutting corners, conducting unauthorized operations using the Purple Gang name without seeking permission. The organization lacked the strict hierarchical discipline necessary to manage operations at this scale. Eddie Fletcher found his East Side gambling business threatened by crews that had expanded without consulting him or the Bernstein brothers. Sammy Cohen's smuggling operations faced interference from newer gang members who believed they deserved access to the most profitable river routes. These conflicts generated constant tension that required leadership attention and resources that could have been devoted to expanding into new areas. Personal grudges and business disputes that had been suppressed during the gang's period of rapid growth were now surfacing as members felt secure enough in their positions to challenge each other openly. Abe Axler and Eddie Fletcher had maintained an uneasy working relationship for years, but their mutual dislike was becoming impossible to ignore. Irving Milberg and Harry Keywell had developed competing claims to certain protection racket territories that generated increasing friction between their respective crews. The approaching end of Prohibition created additional uncertainty that affected every aspect of Purple Gang operations. Politicians and newspapers were discussing repeal with increasing frequency, and public opinion was shifting toward acceptance of legal alcohol sales. Gang members understood that their primary source of income would eventually disappear, but they disagreed about how to prepare for this transition and which alternative criminal enterprises offered the best opportunities for continued prosperity. Some members advocated for expanding their involvement in labor racketeering, following the successful model they had established with the Cleaners and Dyers Association. Others preferred to focus on gambling operations that provided steady income without the violence and law enforcement attention associated with their protection rackets. Still others wanted to move into drug trafficking, which promised enormous profits but involved federal enforcement agencies that had proven more effective than local police in prosecuting criminal organizations, paranoia began spreading through the organization as the combination of internal conflicts, territorial disputes, and uncertainty about the future created an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and distrust. Members suspected each other of skimming profits from joint operations, cooperating with law enforcement agencies, or planning to establish independent criminal organizations that would compete with Purple Gang interests. These suspicions were often based on minor incidents or misunderstandings that would have been ignored during their earlier period of rapid expansion and shared prosperity. The Bernstein brothers found themselves spending increasing amounts of time mediating disputes between their own members rather than planning new criminal enterprises or expanding their operations into untapped markets. Their reputation for extreme violence, which had been so effective in intimidating external enemies, now seemed inadequate for maintaining discipline within their own organization. Members who had willingly accepted their leadership during the gang's rise were now questioning their decisions and challenging their authority over various aspects of the criminal empire. By the early 1930s, internal strife, arrests, and rival violence had already begun to break the gang apart, and by 1935 the Purples had largely lost control of Detroit's underworld, with many members dead or imprisoned. The organization was fragmenting into competing factions that maintained the appearance of unity while pursuing increasingly independent agendas. The structure that had once been their greatest strength had become a source of weakness that threatened to destroy everything they had built. The Bernstein brothers were losing control over an organization that was consuming itself from within. Tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface for months were reaching a breaking point that would require decisive action. Someone would have to make a move that would either restore order to the Purple Gang or eliminate the sources of conflict permanently. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether their criminal empire could survive its own success, and the solution would come in a form that none of them expected. ****. The answer came on Thursday morning, September 16, 1931. When 3 Purple Gang members walked into what they believed was a peace meeting designed to resolve the territorial disputes and power struggles that were tearing their organization apart. Herman Paul, Joseph Lebowitz, and Isidore Sutker had been summoned to apartment 211 at 1740 Collingwood Avenue by Ray Bernstein, Irving Milberg, and Harry Keywell, who claimed they wanted to prevent internal conflicts from destroying everything the Purple Gang had built. Paul controlled gambling operations on the West Side that generated substantial weekly income. Lebowitz managed protection rackets in the downtown area that extracted tribute from dozens of businesses. Sutker oversaw smuggling operations that moved Canadian liquor across the Detroit River for distribution throughout Michigan and neighboring states. The 3 men represented different factions within the organization that had been feuding over territory, profits, and decision-making authority. The meeting organizers presented themselves as concerned gang members seeking compromise and reconciliation. Through face-to-face discussion, they suggested that the quiet residential building would provide privacy for sensitive negotiations without attracting attention from neighbors or law enforcement. Sol Levine, who had escorted them to the apartment, understood the real purpose behind this supposedly peaceful gathering. Rather than seeking compromise, the organizers had decided that eliminating their rivals was the only way to restore their authority over the fragmenting organization. The meeting was carefully planned as an execution that would send a clear message to other Purple Gang members about the consequences of challenging established leadership. The apartment had been prepared for what was about to happen. When Paul, Lebowitz, and Sutker arrived that afternoon, they found their supposed allies waiting with weapons already drawn. The 3 men realized they had walked into a trap, but the confined space and superior numbers of their attackers made escape impossible. They faced the same swift, merciless violence that the Purple Gang had inflicted on countless victims over the years. The execution was conducted with cold efficiency. No time was wasted on explanations or negotiations that might have provided the victims with opportunities to defend themselves. Paul collapsed near the apartment entrance. Lebowitz fell beside an overturned chair, his hands still reaching toward a weapon he never had the chance to draw. Sutker died against the far wall, his blood creating stains that would provide physical evidence for the police investigation that would inevitably follow. Sol Levine witnessed the entire massacre, understanding immediately that he had just observed the climax of the Purple Gang's internal civil war. The three victims had represented significant power within the organization, controlling operations that generated substantial portions of the gang's total income. Their elimination would create power vacuums that surviving members would fight to fill, potentially leading to additional violence that could destroy the remaining organizational structure. The bodies were left in the apartment as a deliberate message to other Purple Gang members who might be considering challenges to the current leadership or planning to establish independent criminal operations. The organizers made no attempt to conceal the crime or dispose of the evidence, understanding that discovery of the murders would demonstrate their willingness to use deadly force against anyone within their own organization who threatened their authority. The Collingwood Manor Massacre represented the culmination of months of growing tension and internal conflict that had been consuming the Purple Gang from within. The same brutal methods that had built their criminal empire were now being turned against their own members, creating a cycle of violence that would ultimately destroy everything they had worked to create. The organization that had dominated Detroit's underworld through fear and intimidation was now using those same tactics to eliminate its own leadership. Sol Levine, who had escorted them, later cooperated with police and gave the testimony that broke the case open. His detailed account of the massacre provided law enforcement with the insider knowledge they had been seeking for years, exposing the gang's internal structure, methods, and key personnel in ways that previous investigations had failed to accomplish. The subsequent trial led to convictions and long prison terms for key figures, including Ray Bernstein, Irving Milberg, and Harry Kewell, which marked the beginning of the gang's rapid dismantling. The internal violence had finally provided authorities with the evidence and witnesses needed to prosecute the gang's leadership successfully. The empire built on violence and intimidation was collapsing under the weight of its own brutality, destroyed by the same ruthless methods that had created its power. The Purple Gang's reputation for being untouchable was about to face its ultimate test in a courtroom where their victims could no longer be silenced through intimidation. What happened next would determine whether the criminal organization that had terrorized Detroit for over a decade could survive the legal reckoning that was about to unfold. The massacre at Collingwood Manor had created the opening that law enforcement had been waiting for, and they were prepared to use every piece of evidence and testimony to bring down the Purple Gang once and for all. Sol Levine's testimony shattered the wall of silence that had protected the Purple Gang for over a decade. For the first time, prosecutors possessed detailed insider knowledge of the organization's structure, methods, and leadership hierarchy. His cooperation enabled prosecutions that sent several leaders to long prison terms, including Ray Bernstein, Irving Milberg, and Harry Kewell, who received life sentences for the Collingwood Manor murders. The successful prosecutions created immediate panic among remaining Purple Gang members, who suddenly understood that their own criminal careers were in serious jeopardy. The code of silence that had been enforced through systematic terror was breaking down as individual members began prioritizing their own survival over collective loyalty. Members who had felt secure under the organization's protection started reconsidering their positions when they realized that cooperation with law enforcement might provide their only chance to avoid similar prosecutions. Levine's detailed knowledge allowed investigators to understand how the organization planned and executed their various illegal enterprises, who held decision-making authority within different criminal activities, and how profits were distributed among members. This insider perspective revealed connections between seemingly unrelated crimes and exposed the systematic nature of the gang's criminal empire. Prosecutors could now build comprehensive cases against multiple Purple Gang members simultaneously, rather than pursuing isolated charges related to individual criminal incidents. The arrests and convictions accelerated a wave of defections, as many Purple Gang members responded to the leadership crisis by fleeing Detroit entirely, abandoning their criminal enterprises, and seeking anonymity in distant cities, where their reputations wouldn't attract law enforcement attention. Others attempted to negotiate plea agreements with prosecutors, offering information about unsolved crimes in exchange for reduced sentences or immunity from prosecution. The exodus of key personnel disrupted criminal operations throughout Detroit, as protection rackets collapsed and smuggling networks ceased functioning. The trial proceedings generated unprecedented media attention that transformed a local criminal case into a national sensation, followed by newspapers across the country. Reporters described the courtroom drama of Sol Levine's testimony, which provided the public with their first detailed glimpse into the Purple Gang's internal operations and decision-making processes. The extensive coverage exposed the gang's methods to other law enforcement agencies and criminal organizations, while demonstrating that even the most feared criminal organizations could be successfully prosecuted when proper evidence became available. However, legal pressure was only one factor in the organization's dissolution. Intergang warfare with rival Sicilian groups, internal betrayals, and additional arrests all combined with the prosecutions to unravel the Purple Gang's control over Detroit's underworld. The same brutal methods that had built their criminal empire were now being used against them by competitors who recognized their vulnerability. Rival organizations moved quickly to claim Purple Gang territories and criminal enterprises while the leadership was imprisoned or in hiding. The psychological impact of seeing their leaders on trial for their lives created additional instability among remaining members who had never faced such serious legal consequences. Previous arrests had involved minor charges related to bootlegging or protection, racket activities that resulted in brief jail sentences or fines that the gang could easily afford. The murder charges represented an existential threat to the organization's survival, as conviction would mean life imprisonment or execution for their most important leaders. Internal conflicts that had been simmering beneath the surface for years erupted into open warfare as different factions competed for control over the fragmenting organization. The same territorial disputes and personal grudges that had led to the Collingwood Manor Massacre continued to generate violence among surviving members. Without strong central leadership to maintain discipline, the organization devolved into competing groups that were more interested in settling old scores than preserving their criminal empire. The convictions and internal betrayals unmoored the organization completely. By the mid-1930s, the Purple Gang had effectively ceased to control Detroit's underworld, their dominance replaced by smaller, more cautious criminal groups that avoided the extreme violence and high-profile methods that had attracted federal attention. The remaining members either faced their own prosecutions, fled to other cities, or attempted to establish independent criminal operations that lacked the resources and organizational structure of their former empire. The successful prosecution of Purple Gang leadership sent a clear message throughout the American criminal underworld that extreme violence and systematic intimidation couldn't provide permanent protection from legal consequences. Other criminal organizations observed the gang's downfall and recognized that their own survival depended on maintaining lower profiles and avoiding the kind of brutal methods that had made the Purple Gang both famous and vulnerable. The criminal organization that had taken years to build and had controlled illegal activities throughout the Great Lakes region was dismantled within a few years of Sol Levine's decision to cooperate with law enforcement authorities. What had once seemed like an unstoppable criminal empire had proven remarkably fragile when subjected to sustained legal pressure, combined with internal conflicts and external competition. The Purple Gang's rapid collapse would serve as both warning and lesson for future criminal organizations seeking to build lasting power through violence and intimidation. The Detroit Purple Gang's story reveals how criminal empires rise and fall through their own contradictions. Their strategy-heavy reliance on terror and loose alliances produced rapid gains, but ultimately made the group fragile when pressures and betrayals emerged. The extreme violence that had intimidated rivals and silenced witnesses eventually turned inward and consumed the very structure they had created. The organizational flexibility that enabled rapid expansion became a source of fatal weakness. When success bred internal competition and paranoia, the name resurfaced decades later in New York, showing how the Detroit Gang's reputation endured. The East Harlem Purple Gang adopted the name in the 1970s, proving that the original organization's fearsome legacy continued to inspire future generations of criminals. If you enjoyed this quiet history, please like or subscribe, and leave a comment about where you're listening from. Wishing you the sweetest dreams. ****.